Commander Daniel Cole had served the United Earth Defense Corps for 15 years, and he thought he had seen everything the galaxy could throw at him. But he was wrong about that assumption. The encrypted message arrived at his terminal in the middle of the night cycle aboard the warship Meridian. And when he read the orders, his hands began to shake with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. He was being assigned to escort 2 alien prisoners from the border station near Valen territory all the way to the maximum security facility on Luna. And the message made it very clear that failure was not an option. What the message did not tell him was that these prisoners were not ordinary criminals or spies or enemy combatants. They were princesses of the Zitharan Empire, daughters of the most powerful ruler in the known galaxy, and their lives were worth more than entire star systems. Daniel walked through the cold metal corridors of his ship toward the holding bay where the prisoners were being kept. And with every step he tried to prepare himself for what he was about to see. Zitharans had been enemies of humanity for almost 100 years, fighting a cold war that sometimes turned hot when tensions boiled over into actual combat. He had lost friends to Zitharan weapons, and he had killed Zitharan soldiers in battle. So the idea of protecting 2 of their royal family members felt strange and uncomfortable when the holding bay doors slid open. Daniel stopped walking and stared at the 2 figures standing behind the energy barrier. They were tall and slender with silver skin that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the cell, and their eyes were a deep violet color that reminded him of the flowers his mother used to grow back on Earth. The elder one was named Calith, and she stood with perfect posture and a cold expression that made it clear she considered Daniel to be beneath her notice. The younger one was Sorvina, and she had the muscular build of a trained fighter, though the neural dampeners on her wrists kept her dangerous abilities suppressed. Daniel had read their files before coming down here, and he knew that Calith was famous for her intelligence and diplomatic skills, while Sorvina was known throughout the galaxy as one of the deadliest warriors her species had ever produced. Together they represented everything the Zitharan Empire valued most, and losing them would be a blow that their father, the Emperor, might never recover from. So you are the human who will be our jailer. Calith spoke first, and her voice had a musical quality that was common among her people. I am your escort. Daniel corrected her firmly, and whether you see me as a jailer is entirely your choice to make. Princess. Calith tilted her head slightly as if she was studying an interesting insect, and Daniel felt his jaw tighten with irritation at the obvious dismissal in her gaze. Sorvina said nothing at all, but her violet eyes tracked every movement Daniel made, analyzing him for weaknesses, the way a predator watches prey. Daniel turned away from them and walked to the security console where he reviewed the transport protocols and double-checked the route they would be taking through space. The journey to Luna would take 3 weeks if everything went perfectly. But Daniel knew that nothing ever went perfectly when you were carrying cargo this valuable. The Korath Syndicate had been the ones who originally captured the princesses during what was supposed to be a diplomatic mission, and they would certainly want their property back. The Korath were a brutal coalition of mercenary species who made their living through slavery and war profiteering, and they had no respect for treaties or borders or basic decency. Human forces had intercepted the Korath transport ship and liberated the princesses. But that rescue had created a whole new set of problems now. Humanity was stuck holding 2 of the most politically sensitive prisoners in galactic history, and every faction with any interest in the outcome was going to come looking for them. Daniel called his senior officers to the bridge for a briefing, and he laid out the situation in simple terms that everyone could understand. Lieutenant Kara Morris was his tactical officer, and she immediately began calculating the most defensible routes Through the sectors they would meet the Cross Sergeant. Victor Hernandez commanded the 40 Marines, assigned to the Meridian, and he started working on security rotations and emergency response protocols. Chief Engineer Samuel Park reported that the ship was in decent shape, but warned that they could not afford any major damage. During the journey, the Meridian was a transport vessel that had been converted for military use, and she was held together by patches and spare parts and the desperate hope that nothing important would break. Daniel listened to his officers, and he felt a familiar weight settling onto his shoulders as the reality of the mission became clear. They were outgunned and outnumbered by almost every potential threat in the region, and their only advantages were speed and the element of surprise. After the briefing ended, Daniel returned to his quarters and found a secondary message waiting for him from Admiral Patricia Vance. The Admiral was one of the few people in the fleet who Daniel truly respected, and her words carried a weight that the official orders had lacked. She wrote that the Zitharan Emperor would burn entire worlds to get his daughters back, and that the Korath would do the same to recapture them. She wrote that the fate of 2 civilizations might depend on whether Daniel could keep those 2 princesses alive long enough to reach Luna. She wrote that she was sorry for giving him this burden, but that there was no one else she trusted to carry it. Daniel deleted the message and sat alone in the darkness of his room for a long time, thinking about all the ways this mission could go wrong. He thought about his crew and how many of them might not survive the journey ahead. He thought about the 2 alien women in the holding bay and how they probably hated him simply for being human. He thought about the vast emptiness of space and all the enemies who were already hunting for them when the Meridian finally departed from the border station and jumped into hyperspace. Daniel stood on the observation deck and watched the stars stretch into lines of light around them. Somewhere out there in the darkness, forces were already moving against them. The Korath wanted their valuable prisoners back, and they would not stop until they got them. The Zitharan War faction wanted the princesses to remain missing, so they could use the crisis to justify attacking humanity. And Daniel Cole, a simple soldier from a small town in Colorado, was the only thing standing between those forces and the 2 women whose lives had been placed in his hands. He did not know if he was ready for this challenge. He did not know if anyone could be ready for something like this, but he knew that he would die before he let anyone take those princesses, because that was what it meant to be human. That was what it meant to protect those who could not protect themselves, and that was the promise he made to himself as the Meridian carried them all deeper into the dangerous unknown. By the 5th day of their journey through space, Daniel knew with absolute certainty that they were being followed by enemy ships. Lieutenant Karen Morris had detected faint energy signatures trailing behind them through the dense clouds of the Ardent Nebula, and the readings suggested at least 3 or maybe 4 vessels maintaining just enough distance to stay hidden from normal scanners. "Do you think they are Korath?" Daniel asked as he studied the tactical display on the bridge. "The ship configurations suggest mercenary vessels." Karen replied with a frown on her face. "But their formation is too disciplined and organized for ordinary pirates or bounty hunters. So someone must have trained them well." Daniel ordered the crew to switch to silent running mode, and they diverted power away from non-essential systems to reduce their energy signature. The Meridian was designed for transport rather than combat, and a direct engagement with multiple enemy warships would almost certainly end in their destruction. He needed to avoid a fight for as long as possible, while Daniel worried about the hunters in the darkness behind them. Something unexpected was happening down in the detention quarters of the ship. Private First Class Benjamin Hayes was a young Marine from Nebraska who had been assigned to guard duty outside the cells where the princesses were being held. Benjamin was not the smartest soldier or the strongest fighter, but he had a friendly nature and a genuine curiosity about the galaxy that made him approach even enemy aliens without fear or hatred, and started talking to the princesses during his long shifts, not interrogating them or trying to extract information, but simply sharing stories about his life back on Earth. He told them about his family farm and the golden wheat fields that stretched toward the horizon under the summer sun. He told them about his younger sister who wanted to be a doctor and his father who still used farming equipment that was older than Benjamin himself. He told them about human holidays and traditions and the simple pleasures of sitting on a porch and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Servina responded to his stories with contempt at first, and she made it clear that she thought humans were primitive creatures who had no business traveling among the stars. But Calith was different, and she listened to everything Benjamin said with an expression of genuine curiosity on her silver face. She asked questions about human customs and why soldiers like Benjamin chose to fight for an entire species rather than a single ruler or royal family. "We fight for each other," Benjamin explained with a smile, "and we fight for the people back home who cannot fight for themselves, because that is what being part of something bigger than yourself really means. Your species has no emperor and no divine mandate to rule." Calith observed with confusion in her violet eyes. "Yet you possess a unity that should be impossible according to everything my people believe about social organization. Maybe that is just being human." Benjamin shrugged. "Or maybe we are too stubborn to let something like logic get in the way of taking care of each other." Daniel observed these interactions through the security cameras in his quarters, and he chose not to intervene or stop them from happening. Intelligence gathering worked in both directions, and the princesses were revealing more about Zitharan culture through these casual conversations than any previous diplomatic exchange had ever managed to uncover. He learned that the Zitharan Empire was built on rigid hierarchy and ancient traditions that had remained unchanged for thousands of years. He learned that the concept of individual choice was almost foreign to their society, because everyone was expected to fulfill the role they were born into. He learned that Calith and Sorvina had never been allowed to make decisions for themselves, and that their entire lives had been planned out by their father, the Emperor, on the 9th day of their journey. The hunters finally made their move against the Meridian. The attack came without any warning when 4 Karith interceptor ships dropped out of hyperspace directly in front of them and powered up their weapons immediately. The lead ship broadcast a simple demand over all communication frequencies, telling the humans to surrender the prisoners or face complete destruction. Daniel stood on the bridge and looked at the tactical display showing the 4 enemy ships surrounding them like wolves closing in on wounded prey. His crew waited for his orders, and he could see the fear in their eyes mixed with determination to do whatever he asked of them. Karen Morris reported that the enemy ships were faster and better armed than the Meridian, and that their chances in a straight fight were very poor. Sergeant Hernandez called from the Marine barracks to say that his soldiers were ready to repel boarders if the enemy tried to take the ship by force. Daniel took a deep breath and made a decision that violated every tactical principle he had ever been taught during his military training. He ordered the helmsman to ram the Meridian directly into the enemy formation at maximum speed, using the larger mass of their ship to scatter the interceptors before they could coordinate their attack. The maneuver was completely insane by any standard of space combat, and no tactical manual in the galaxy would have recommended such a reckless approach. But humans had built their reputation throughout the stars by doing impossible things when they were backed into corners with no other options. Meridian lurched forward and smashed through the Karith formation like a charging bull, and the enemy ships were forced to break apart to avoid being crushed. The battle that followed was brutal and bloody and over within minutes. Daniel lost 12 crew members, including 2 of his best engineers who died when a plasma bolt tore through the engine compartment. But when the debris finally settled and the sensors cleared, 3 Korath ships were disabled and drifting dead in space, while the 4th was fleeing into the void at maximum speed. That night, after the wounded were treated and the dead were honored, Calith requested a private meeting with Daniel in the conference room. When he arrived, she was standing by the viewport and looking out at the stars with an expression he had never seen on her face before. "Your kind fights without any regard for your own survival," she said quietly, "and the Korath expected you to negotiate or surrender because that is what any rational species would do when facing superior forces. Negotiation requires trust." Daniel replied as he stood beside her, "And I do not trust slavers who kidnap innocent people and sell them for profit. The Korath are not accustomed to prey that fights back so fiercely." Calith turned to look at him directly, "And I must admit that I am also not accustomed to such behavior from any species." There was something new in her violet eyes that might have been respect or admiration, or simply confusion at encountering creatures who refused to act the way she expected. "Your people have been our enemies for a long time," Daniel said carefully, "but that does not mean we have to remain enemies forever." Calith was silent for a long moment before she spoke again. "No, Commander Cole," she said with the faintest hint of warmth creeping into her voice. "Perhaps it does not mean that at all." Daniel nodded and left her alone with her thoughts. But as he walked back to his quarters, he felt something shift in the air around them. The walls between human and Zitharan had developed their first crack, and he wondered what might grow through that opening in the days to come. The Meridian limped through the darkness of space with half its systems damaged or completely destroyed, and the crew was exhausted from days of constant work trying to keep the ship alive. Daniel had ordered strict rationing of food and water because they could not afford to stop at any station for supplies, and the morale among his people was dropping lower with each passing hour. He walked through the corridors and saw the tired faces of men and women who had given everything they had to protect. 2 alien prisoners who probably did not even appreciate their sacrifice. The repairs were going slowly because they had lost their best engineers in the battle, and Chief Park was working around the clock just to keep the life support systems functioning properly. Kara Morris reported that long-range sensors had detected more ships heading in their direction, and it was only a matter of time before the next attack came. Daniel felt the weight of command pressing down on him like a physical force that was slowly crushing his spirit. It was during this lowest and darkest moment that Servina finally broke a long silence and requested to speak with him urgently. The guards called Daniel in the middle of the night cycle to tell him that the warrior princess was demanding a private audience, and something in their voices told him this was important. He arrived at her cell. He found her standing with her back straight and her head held high, and her posture was no longer that of a defeated prisoner, but of a warrior preparing for battle. "You need to know the truth about our capture," Servina said without any greeting or polite introduction, "because everything you believe about this situation is wrong." Daniel crossed his arms and waited for her to continue, wondering what new complication was about to make his life even more difficult. The story she told over the next hour changed everything he thought he knew about the mission. The Zitharan Emperor, the father of these 2 princesses, had actually planned their abduction himself as part of a complicated political scheme. A powerful faction within the powerful faction within the Empire was pushing for open war against humanity, and they had enough influence to make that war inevitable unless something dramatic happened to change the political landscape. The Emperor believed that a crisis involving his daughters would unite the Zitharan people behind a peace initiative, because everyone would be so focused on rescuing the princesses that the war faction would lose their momentum. Calith and Servina were supposed to be captured by carefully selected agents and then rescued in a staged operation that would make the Emperor looked like a hero who valued peace over revenge. But the Korath Syndicate had intercepted the original plan and captured the princesses for their own purposes before the stage rescue could take place. Now everything was spinning out of control, and nobody knew how to fix the mess that had been created. Our father is a fool, Sorvina said with bitter anger in her voice, because he gambled with our lives for the sake of politics. And now we are all paying the price for his arrogance. What happens if we continue to Luna as planned? Daniel asked quietly. The war faction will use our imprisonment by humans as proof that your species cannot be trusted, Sorvina explained. And they will convince our people that only military force can protect the Empire from human aggression. So delivering you safely would actually make things worse? It would guarantee a war that will kill billions on both sides, Sorvina confirmed with a grim expression. On her silver face, Daniel stood in silence for a long time as he processed this information and tried to figure out what to do next. Everything he had been ordered to do would lead to disaster, and following his mission would result in the very outcome he was trying to prevent. He thought about Admiral Vance and her message, about the fate of two civilizations resting on his shoulders. He thought about his crew and all the sacrifices they had made to get this far. He thought about Benjamin Hayes and the unlikely friendship that was forming between a farm boy from Nebraska and an alien princess. Then he made a decision that would almost certainly end his military career and might get him executed for treason. What if there was another option? He said slowly, what if you returned to your empire not as rescued prisoners, but as ambassadors who chose to seek peace with humanity? Keleth had been listening from the adjoining cell, and she stepped forward with surprise, showing clearly on her face. You would actually release us and trust us not to betray you the moment we are free. I would trust you to want something better than a war that destroys everything, Daniel replied honestly. Because I have seen how you look at my crew, and I have heard the questions you ask, Benjamin, about human culture. And what have you concluded from these observations? Keleth asked with genuine curiosity. That you have curiosity and intelligence and a desire to understand things beyond what you were taught as children, Daniel said. And those are not the qualities of someone who wants to see my species destroyed. The two sisters looked at each other and communicated silently in that mysterious way that twins sometimes share. Daniel waited patiently because he knew this decision could not be rushed or forced. Finally, Keleth spoke again with a thoughtful expression. There is a neutral station called the Convergence that sits at the junction of 7 major trade routes, she said, and it is claimed by no species and governed by no single power. What could we accomplish there? If we broadcast a declaration of peace from that station, neither the war faction nor the Korath could silence us, Keleth explained, because the entire galaxy would hear our message and know that we chose cooperation over conflict. How far away is this station? 6 days of travel through space that is controlled by the Korath Syndicate, Sorvina answered. So the journey would be extremely dangerous, even for a ship in perfect condition. Daniel looked at the two princesses, and he saw something in their eyes that had not been there before. He saw hope mixed with fear, mixed with something that might have been the beginning of trust. Then I suggest we get started immediately, he said with a slight smile. Because my ship may be damaged and my crew may be exhausted, but we are still breathing. And that means we can still fight. Keleth reached through the energy barrier and placed her hand near his in a gesture of gratitude. You are not like other humans I have encountered, she said softly. And you are not like the Zitherans I was taught to hate, Daniel replied. So perhaps we can learn to be better together than we were apart. He walked back to the bridge and ordered a new course plotted toward the Convergence station. The Official mission was over, and a new mission had begun. They were no longer captors and prisoners traveling toward an uncertain destination. They were allies heading toward a chance to change the fate of two civilizations. The journey toward the convergence station was the most terrifying experience that anyone aboard the Meridian had ever endured. The Korath Syndicate had placed an enormous bounty on the ship that attracted every pirate and bounty hunter and mercenary. In the entire sector, it seemed like new enemies appeared on the sensors every few hours. And Daniel's exhausted crew fought 3 more desperate battles just to keep moving forward. They lost more good people with each engagement, and the list of names to be honored grew longer, while the list of functional systems grew shorter by the time they finally reached the outer boundaries of neutral space. The Meridian was barely holding together, and everyone aboard knew they were lucky to still be alive. But something remarkable had happened during those dark and desperate days of running and fighting. The walls that separated human from Zitharan had begun to crumble and fall away. Daniel had released the princesses from their cells after the 3rd battle because he needed every capable person helping with repairs and defense. Akilith had immediately gone to work alongside Karen Morris in the navigation room, and her mathematical genius combined with human engineering creativity to solve problems that neither species could have handled alone. They recalculated fuel consumption rates and plotted more efficient routes and found ways to squeeze extra speed from the damaged engines. Karen had been suspicious of the alien princess at first, but that suspicion faded quickly when she saw how hard Keleth was willing to work. She has a good mind, Karen told Daniel privately, and she thinks in ways that are different from us but complementary to our approach. Meanwhile, Sorvina had joined the Marines in their training sessions, and she began teaching them Zitharan combat techniques while learning human fighting methods. In return, Sergeant Hernandez watched the alien warrior spar with his soldiers, and he came away impressed by her skill and her willingness to share knowledge. She moves like water, he reported to Daniel, and our people are learning things from her that will make them better fighters. Benjamin Hayes spent every free moment with Sorvina, and their initial hostility had transformed into mutual respect and something that looked like genuine friendship. They argued about tactics and debated the merits of different weapons and shared stories about the battles they had survived. Your kind surprises me constantly, Sorvina admitted to Benjamin after a particularly intense training session left them both breathing hard. How so? Benjamin asked with a grin despite the bruises forming on his arms. You are physically weaker than us, and your lives are so much shorter, Sorvina explained, and you have no natural weapons or armor or any of the advantages that my people take for granted. That does sound pretty bad when you list it all out like that. Yet you refuse to surrender no matter how impossible the odds become. Sorvina continued with wonder in her voice. And you adapt and improvise and turn every weakness into some kind of strange strength. Stubbornness is our greatest national resource. Benjamin laughed. No, Sorvina shook her head seriously. It is more than simple stubbornness that drives your species forward. She looked at him with her violet eyes, and Benjamin felt something shift in the space between them. My people have followed the same traditions for thousands of years, Sorvina said quietly, but your species has conquered the stars in just a few centuries starting from nothing. Maybe that means we need each other, Benjamin suggested, because your wisdom and experience combined with our creativity and flexibility could accomplish amazing things. Sorvina considered his words carefully before responding. Perhaps you are correct. Benjamin Hayes from Nebraska, she said with the faintest hint of a smile. Perhaps you are correct. Daniel watched all of these connections forming, and he felt cautious optimism growing in his chest. Two species who had been enemies for generations could find common ground on a damaged ship while fleeing through hostile territory. Then maybe there was real hope for a larger peace. The Convergence Station finally appeared on the long-range sensors like a brilliant jewel, floating in the empty void of space. The massive structure glittered with lights from hundreds of different species who had come there to trade and negotiate and find temporary peace from the conflicts that raged elsewhere in the galaxy. Here, bitter enemies became business partners, and ancient hatreds were set aside in pursuit of profit and mutual benefit. But Daniel's hope turned to cold dread when the sensors revealed what was waiting for Thema. Blockade of 15 Karth warships had surrounded the station, and they were clearly positioned to intercept anyone trying to reach it. The lead ship broadcast a message on all frequencies, demanding that the Meridians surrender the princesses immediately or face complete destruction. Daniel gathered his officers and the two princesses on the bridge to discuss their options. Karen reported that 15 warships was far more firepower than they could possibly survive, even if every system on the Meridian was working perfectly. Sergeant Hernandez and his Marines would fight to the last soldier, but acknowledged that boarding actions against that many ships would be suicide. Chief Park simply shook his head and said the engines might last another hour of hard maneuvering before they failed completely. Everyone looked at Daniel and waited for him to make a decision. He thought about ordering the escape pods launched so that at least some of his crew might survive. He thought about surrendering and hoping the Karth would honor their word to spare the human lives. He thought about running and trying to find another path to safety. Then he looked at the faces around him and saw something that made all of those options feel wrong. His crew was exhausted and wounded and terrified, but none of them were asking to give up. Karen had her hand on her console, ready to execute whatever maneuver he ordered. Hernandez was already checking his weapon and preparing for a fight he knew he probably would not survive. Even Chief Park was running calculations on how to get a few more minutes of power from the dying engines. I will not order anyone to remain here, Daniel said quietly, because the escape pods are functional, and anyone who wants to leave may do so without any dishonor. Nobody moved or spoke or even looked toward the escape pod access points. Karen Morris broke the silence with words that spoke for everyone present. We did not come all this way and lose all those good people just to quit now. Commander, Kelleth stepped forward and placed her silver hand on Daniel's shoulder in a gesture of trust that was almost unheard of in Zitharan culture. Then let us show these Karth monsters what humans and Zitharans can accomplish when they work together, she said firmly. Daniel looked at the tactical display one more time, and then he smiled grimly. All hands prepare for battle, he announced over the ship-wide communication system, because today we write a new chapter in the history of two civilizations. The battle for the Convergence Station would become legendary throughout the galaxy, and stories about it would be told for generations to come. 15 Karth warships against one crippled human transport vessel should have been no contest at all, and every tactical analysis would have predicted a quick and brutal defeat for the Meridian. But Daniel Cole had something the Karth commanders did not expect. He had allies. The moment the Meridian crossed into the communication range of the Convergence Station, Kelleth began broadcasting on every available frequency. Her voice carried across space to thousands of ships and stations and settlements, and she spoke with the authority of a princess who had finally found something worth fighting for. She declared her intention to seek lasting peace between the Zitharan Empire and humanity, and she described the courage of the human crew who had protected her and her sister against impossible odds. She talked about Daniel Cole and his decision to risk his career and his life because he believed that two species could learn to be better together than apart. She talked about Benjamin Hayes and the stories he had shared about wheat fields and family farms and the simple human desire to protect those who needed protection. She talked about Karen Morris and Chief Park and Sergeant Hernandez and all the humans who had died so that two alien princesses could reach this moment. When Kelleth finished, Sylvina took over the broadcast with a message aimed directly at her own people. She called upon all Zitherans everywhere to reject the war faction and their poisonous hatred of humanity. She admitted that their father, the Emperor, had made terrible mistakes. But she argued that those mistakes did not have to define the future of either species. She spoke about what she had learned during her time aboard the Meridian and how her understanding of humans had completely transformed. I was taught that humans were primitive and dangerous creatures who needed to be controlled or destroyed, Sorvina declared. But I have discovered that they are brave and loyal and capable of extraordinary compassion. They do not fight because they enjoy violence, she continued, but because they refuse to abandon those who depend on them for protection. If we go to war against such a species, we will destroy ourselves in the process, she warned, because humans do not know how to surrender, and they will fight until nothing remains. Choose peace instead, she pleaded, and let us build something new together. The broadcast reached ships throughout the sector and beyond, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. 3 Zitharan warships that had been secretly monitoring the situation broke from their concealment and engaged the Korath blockade. Their commanders had been sent by elements within the Empire who opposed the war faction, and they had been waiting for exactly this kind of signal. They opened fire on the nearest Korath vessels and drew several ships away from the blockade to respond to this new threat. Then, something even more incredible happened. A human patrol squadron that had been tracking the Meridian arrived from hyperspace on the opposite side of the battle. These were ships that had been searching for Daniel and his crew, uncertain whether to arrest them for disobeying orders or rescue them from the Korath. Commanding officer made her decision in an instant when she saw Zitharan and human vessels fighting side by side against a common enemy. She ordered her ships to join the battle, and they crashed into the Korath formation with weapons blazing. The Korath commanders found themselves facing opposition from 2 species that had been enemies for a century, but were now fighting together as allies. Their carefully planned blockade fell apart as ships scrambled to respond to threats coming from multiple directions. The battle raged for nearly an hour, with explosions lighting up the darkness of space. Like fireworks, Daniel guided the Meridian through the chaos, avoiding the heaviest fighting while making sure the broadcast continued transmitting. Kara and Morris performed miracles of navigation that kept them alive despite the damaged state of their ship. Chief Park somehow coaxed enough power from the failing engines to maintain speed and maneuverability. Sergeant Hernandez led his Marines in repelling 3 separate boarding attempts by Korath soldiers who managed to breach the hull. And through it all, Kelith and Sorvina continued their broadcast, adding their voices to the calls for peace and cooperation. When the last Korath ship finally retreated into hyperspace, a strange silence fell over the battlefield. Human and Zitharan vessels drifted alongside each other, their crews uncertain how to proceed. Now that the fighting was over, Daniel ordered the Meridian to dock at the convergence station, and he walked through the corridors of his battered ship one final time. He passed crew members who were tending wounds and repairing damage and mourning friends who had not survived. He passed Benjamin Hayes standing next to Sorvina, and he saw the young Marine reach out and take the alien princess's hand in a gesture of comfort. Past Karen Morris and Kelith working together on a status report, their heads bent close as they discussed technical details in a mixture of human English and Zitharan language. When Daniel finally reached the observation deck, he stood and looked out at the convergence station and the ships that surrounded it. Representatives from dozens of species were already requesting meetings and information about what had happened. News of the battle and the broadcast was spreading across the galaxy faster than any ship could travel. The war faction within the Zitharan Empire was scrambling to respond to a situation they had never anticipated, and somewhere far away, the Emperor was watching everything unfold and wondering how his carefully planned scheme had produced such unexpected results. Kelith and Sorvina joined Daniel on the observation deck, and for a long moment the 3 of them simply stood together in silence. What happens now? Daniel finally asked. Now the real work begins. Caliph replied, because there are treaties to negotiate and old wounds to heal and trust to build between our peoples. It will take years. Sovina added, maybe decades before we can truly call ourselves allies rather than former enemies. But it starts here. Caliph said with a smile, with a human warrior who saw prisoners and chose to see people instead. Daniel thought about everyone who had been lost during the journey and all the sacrifices that had brought them to this moment. He made a silent promise that their names would be remembered and their courage would never be forgotten. I have a request, Caliph said with warmth in her violet eyes, and I hope you will consider it seriously. What kind of request? When the formal negotiations begin between our species, I want you to be there as a representative of everything that makes humanity worthy of respect. I am just a soldier. Daniel protested weakly. No, Sovina corrected him firmly. You are a warrior, and there is an important difference between those two things. Soldiers follow orders without question, she explained. But warriors fight for what they believe in, even when it costs them everything. Behind them, the surviving crew of the Meridian was gathering on the deck. Humans and Zitherans stood together, united by the experiences they had shared and the bonds they had formed. Benjamin Hayes was laughing at something Sovina had said, and Karen Morris was deep in conversation with Caliph about navigation algorithms. It was a small beginning. Daniel realized just a single ship and a handful of people and a fragile hope for something better. But that was how all great things started in this universe, with ordinary individuals making extraordinary choices. Daniel Cole, warrior of Earth, nodded to the princesses who had become something very much like friends. Then I suppose I need to find a nicer uniform for these negotiations. Caliph laughed softly and Sovina smiled. And somewhere in the vast darkness between distant stars, a new chapter in galactic history had finally begun to unfold.